Folks, the human race is at a unique time in our history. Simultaneously, half of the civilized world remembers a world with no cell phones. Some to the point that a cell phone was just the stuff of science fiction, while the other half will never know what it's like to live life without one. They're connected to it. I mentioned the civilized world on purpose. Half of humanity also has no access to electricity. Think about that for just a moment. Globally, every other person does not have access to electricity, much less a cell phone, which is such a sad reality for a planet a mere 24,000 miles across. That's just 1/10 the distance to the closest object in space, which is the moon. So what's the deal? Why on earth would civilization allow such a disparity in the allotment of resources? There's only one main reason. It's really the reason from which all the world's troubles stem. It's greed, and more specifically, profit. Everything is profit driven. I mean literally everything. Schools test on the amount of knowledge students accumulate. Employees get promotions based on how they profit their employers. Most of us, we won't stay in a relationship that's completely one-sided. We got to profit from these things, or they quickly lose our interest. The law of abundance states that there is such an abundance of resources in the universe that there's plenty for everyone. Now, profit isn't all bad. As a matter of fact, profit really becomes dangerous when it benefits the few and excludes the many. The rich and powerful in America make up a very small part of the population percentage-wise, yet they're somehow able to maintain power by creating the rule book that the rest of us are expected to follow. We do as we're told, afraid to speak up for fear of being cast aside as conspiracy theorists and thus reducing our share of the overall profits. The sugar lobby and pharmaceutical companies have us walking around like zombies, too dumbed down and distracted to even notice what's really going on around us. We gotta come to the realization that these entities have a vested interest in allowing us to allow them to make our decisions for us. They profit from our ignorance. We trust these companies with a blind sort of faith, the kind that many of us wouldn't even afford our family in many cases. How many of you would cut ties with a family member or friend who was caught lying at your expense? Probably most of you, I'd say. Well, you do it in your relationships with big corporations every day by supporting them. At one time, Big Tobacco even paid doctors to be in their commercials, promoting their product. How ludicrous does something like that sound today? Yet, it's taken decades to take the steps necessary to finally warn the public about the obvious dangers of smoking, with the tobacco lobby fighting disclosure at every single opportunity. Now, the cure for this current disease of the mind is a systematic one. In order to create a cure, instead of just a treatment, we got to strive towards a new framework of thinking. One of objectivity and based on critical thinking skills. It seems so simple. The answer can't be right in front of our faces, or can it? And if so, how could we not see it all along? Well, the fact is, all truths are hidden in plain sight. Newton didn't invent gravity, just as Albert Einstein didn't invent relativity. Glass wasn't invented. These things were discovered by men who saw things differently than everyone else. Now, maybe it was their intellect that led them to enlightenment, or possibly something greater, like their destiny. Either way, a valuable lesson can be learned from the knowledge that everything that ever was is nothing more than another new discovery of the universe. And that these discoveries are just hidden in plain sight. The message is clear. Knowledge is the tool. The more you possess, the more likely you are to put yourself in a position to discover something new. Whether that be about yourself or the world around you. Luckily, the half of the world with access to electricity, and I'm sure everyone listening to this or hearing it, you hold all the world's knowledge in your pocket in the form of a cell phone with internet access. Now, unfortunately, knowing that the information is available and in your pocket just isn't enough. And in fact, that framework of thinking is incredibly dangerous. The fact is, where we get our information is just as important as what information we're receiving. The curse of the world is greed, and therefore we've always, in every instance, got to take a step back, analyze what the author of any new information has to gain from us believing it. It's become so much more difficult in 2015 to tell when we're being sold something. With new phenomena like targeted marketing in your Facebook and native advertising in the news, it's very easy to misinterpret fact from fiction. So, what now? How do we fix this growing problem? More importantly, how do we protect ourselves from being taken advantage of? We arm ourselves. That's how. But not with guns. No, instead we arm ourselves with information. Just as physics is the explanation of complex mathematical equations, the answers that we seek are not simple answers. We all experience things differently. Some of us a little differently and some a lot differently. No two people are alike, no two cultures are alike. We all share common ground though, and it's in this common ground that many of the answers lie. The key is looking at the problem differently by making the choice not to focus on what we don't yet know and realizing that we know enough to get the ball rolling. There is a starting point that we can all agree on. A simple exercise of the mind that can help anyone of any age, gender, race, political affiliation, whatever you want to separate us by, we can all agree on one thing. It's not a revelation, though it is brilliant. Now, before beginning this journey, we got to realize and be willing to accept that A to Z that's not one step. No, not even close. As a matter of fact, A to Z is actually many equal and important steps, each one building upon the last. The first step, though, is awareness. Now, awareness is step one, more specifically, building upon awareness of oneself in order to foster an awareness of one's surroundings. Self-awareness is defined by Wikipedia as the capacity for introspection and the ability to recognize oneself as an individual and separate from the environment and other individuals. Now, what does that mean? And how can you apply that, and how's that the secret? Well, let's break it down into parts and see if that helps us absorb it any better. Now, self is narrowly defined as the subject of one's own experience. Now, this is important since just as no two people are the same, no two people's experiences are the same. Now, in other words, it is entirely possible for both parties in a discussion to be right at the same time, at least to some degree, based on their experience. Now, awareness, it's defined as the ability to perceive, to feel, or to be conscious of events, objects, thoughts, emotions, and sensory patterns. So self-awareness then is simply the ability to perceive patterns or triggers in our own experience and thus be better able to recognize more effective ways to respond to current and future situations. Now, this is made easier by the brain's natural ability to detect patterns. Another way to think of self-awareness is simply putting the idea of practical wisdom to work for you. Now, practical wisdom, the idea, it's originally a Greek word, phronesis, and it's long been considered a virtue. It was actually the subject of much of Aristotle's teachings. The importance of practical wisdom is that the person not only has the knowledge of what is good or bad for him or her in a theoretical sense, but also that person has the capacity to act on such knowledge as well. Now, practical wisdom is what allows us to not only see the role of emotions in our decision making, but it's also the mechanism that allows us the opportunity to display personal responsibility by the application of that wisdom gained through our experience as individuals. Now, there are many exercises, both physically and academically, that can aid in the accumulation of awareness. The social sciences, such as psychology and sociology, have broken down the patterns of human behavior to such a degree that almost any human action is explainable through supported evidence. By grasping a working knowledge of each of these disciplines, one is sure to increase his or her awareness. Now, it's certainly not the only way to increase awareness though, and the quickest and most effective way to increase one's awareness seems to be through the practice of mindfulness. Now, mindfulness is simply being aware, moment to moment, of one's subjective conscious experience from a first-person perspective. Think of the practice of mindfulness as an active and open attention to the present. Now, self-knowledge requires more than just intellectual self-examination, and practical wisdom allows us to apply what we examine through introspection, although not to the point of self-absorption or overthinking. Those can both be really bad news. Now, as thinking beings, the fact